lower, right?
Okay. Hold it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay over there.
There's a lot of reflection. The lights, they're going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is. I don't think there's anywhere that it's going to.
And
Is the other side non-reflective?
like here?
The other side matte? Is it shiny like that?
It's all
Yes,
the way
it's
on
all
the
shiny.
opposite side. You can see.
Yeah, it is.
So it's better to lean it forward.
Yeah,
Maybe just tell me if you
no,
can.
it's shiny.
Yeah, no,
It's
it's
only
just
black.
reflective.
No, you need to incline.
It has a pitch forward.
They're working on it.
Like,
Or much back.
Yes, more, even more. Because come over and you will see lines reflecting.
Let it go forward.
You ignore it.
I am busy.
let's go
You
in.
can't just think that you can just, hey, stop. I'm sorry, I'm just talking to my colleague.
Yes, now important. Like around 7, 8.
I know. I talked to my friend. You know, I don't know.
I don't think there's anything we can do about stopping the reflection.
They hold enough.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I think it's just the material and the light thing. Like it's just. They're trying to help the easel to reduce it, but I don't know if there's anything that's gonna.
יכול רגע להגיד לי אם זה, if we can see the light?
Yes. You can see the light.
No, but
These, so I think you need to aim it up, not down. Try, let's just see the difference.
Incline towards us.
I think that
Right, more.
it will fall. There's zero chance it will stay. You try it.
Still reflection.
But it can't be like.
Not that bad, but
and now
you know what? Ask Janet to stay there and hold it. No, really.
I wish.
It's a good idea.
But now it's okay though.
No. No. Come over and you will see from before.
You can see the two big lights.
And can't it be like
You're getting reflection from
like
these.
like that, like a movie that you could here.
Janet, you're perfect.
Hmm?
That's perfect. No reflection.
This is Danny's, right? Okay. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for this special joint press stakeout Before this morning's Security Council session on the issue of the Israeli hostages still held in Gaza, Israel's ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, will deliver a brief media statement. Following Ambassador Danon, we will be hearing from our very special guest, Eli Sharabi. For 491 days, Eli was held in brutal and unimaginable captivity by Hamas in Gaza. At his release, he learned of another nightmare, the murder of his British-born wife Leanne and two daughters, Noya and Yael. At 10 a.m., Eli will also be briefing the Security Council members inside. After Eli's statement here, we are honored to be joined by acting U.S. Representative to the United Nations, Dorothy Shea, who will also make a statement. Please note that we will not be taking questions at this stakeout, but if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. Thank you. Ambassador Danon.
Good morning. Today we stand before you with a simple truth. The fight for the hostages is far from over. I would like to thank Ambassador Shai for standing with us today. Standing beside me is Eli Sharabi, a man whose life was shattered on October 7. Eli was taken from his home in Kibbutz Be'eri by Hamas terrorists, dragged into Gaza, and held underground for 491 days. For 491 days, he was beaten, starved, and tortured, chained like an animal in the darkness of Hamas's terror tunnels. When he was finally released, he returned to a nightmare. His wife, Leanne, and their two daughters, Noya and Yael, were murdered. His brother, Yossi, was murdered in captivity and still remains in Gaza, denied even the dignity of burial. Eli is here today because he survived. He is here to look into the eyes of those who have kept silent and tell them the truth. For too long, the UN has looked away. For too long, the Security Council has looked away. But Israel will not look away. We will not fail them. There are too many in this building who want us to turn the page and move on. There are others who mention the hostages as if they are checking a box, not because they really care for them. Some even fail to mention the hostages at all. However, after Eli Sharabi's testimony, no one will be able to ignore them. No one will be able to simply check boxes. The world will hear his story, and the world will have to make a choice, to stand with the hostages or to stand with the terrorists. Thank you.
My name is Eli Sharabi. I am 53 years old. I've come back from hell. I've returned to tell my story. I used to live in Kibbutz Be'eri with my British-born wife, Leanne, and my daughters, Noya and Yael. It was a beautiful community. We were all passionate about creating the best life for our children and for our neighbors. Leanne and I was married for 23 years and had two wonderful daughters and the dog Mocha. On October 7, my heaven turned to hell. Sirens began. Hamas terrorists invaded, and I was ripped away from my family, never to see them again. That morning, after the sirens began, I tried to reassure Leanne. The army will come. They always come, I told her, but they didn't. The terrorists infiltrated our community. The terrorists broke down our door. The dog barked, and the terrorists opened fire. My wife and I threw ourselves over our daughters, screaming for them to stop. They dragged me away as I called out to my girls, "I will be back." I had to believe that. I didn't know I should have said goodbye forever. Outside, my peaceful home was gone. Over 100 terrorists were laughing, celebrating, filming themselves in our gardens. They beat me as they dragged me toward Gaza. My ribs were bruised. My face was swollen. And when we reached the border, a mob of civilians trying to lynch me. They pulled me from the car, but the terrorists rushed me away into a mosque. I was their trophy. For 491 days, I was kept underground in Hamas terror tunnels, chained, starved, beaten, humiliated. The chains they kept me in tore into my skin from the moment I entered until the moment I was released. I was given almost no food, no water, and no mercy. I was treated worse than animal. I was fed a piece of pita a day, maybe a sip of tea. I had to beg for food, beg to use the bathroom. Begging became my existence. And through it all, I held on to the hope that I would see my family again. When I was released on February 8, 2025, I weighed just 44 kilos. I had lost over 30 kilos. I arrived home and they told me my mother and sister were waiting for me. I said, "Get me my wife and daughters." And that was when I knew. They were gone. They had been murdered. My brother Yossi was murdered in captivity. He is still being held in Gaza, denied the dignity of burial. Just before my release, Hamas took pleasure in showing me a picture of my brother Yossi. They told me he was dead. It was like they had brought a massive hammer down on me. I refused to believe it. Where was the Red Cross when we needed them? Where was the United Nations? 491 days of torment, 491 days of starvation, of being chained underground. And no one came. No one in Gaza helped me. The civilians saw us suffering, and they cheered our kidnappers. They were definitely involved. I'm here today because I survived. But survival is not enough. Not when 59 hostages are still there. I was freed less than 6 weeks ago. I've come here to be the United Nations with a simple message. Bring them all home. I met President Trump at the White House and thanked him for securing my release and many others. I appreciate his efforts to free those still held. I told him we must bring them all home. I met with Prime Minister Starmer at 10 Downing Street. I told him as well, we must bring them all home. Now, I will stand before the United Nations Security Council to say this. No more excuses. No more delays. No more moral blindness. You cannot claim to stand for humanity and abandon those who are still in hell. I say now to every state, to every person in a position of power, to every person who has listened to me today, Bring them all home. Now. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. And I want to express special gratitude and admiration for Mr. Eli Sharabi for being here today to provide a firsthand account illustrating the brutality of Hamas. And thank you also, Ambassador Danon. Your difficult but necessary testimony, Mr. Sharabi, will offer the Security Council an important perspective, reminding us all of how Hamas started this conflict on October 7th, 2023, with its horrific terrorist attack, wherein they took 250 people hostage. The United States is honored to have Mr. Sharabi here, and it is important for the Council to hear directly from hostages who were kept in Hamas captivity. They are witnesses and they are survivors whose testimony provides evidence of the barbarity of Hamas. Mr. Sharabi is particularly brave. He lost his wife, Lian, daughters, Noya and Yahel, brother Yossi, when Hamas murdered each one of them. His brother Yossi's body is still being held by Hamas in Gaza, as he just said. Despite this horrific ordeal and the extreme sorrow he is experiencing, he continues relentlessly to advocate for the release of all the hostages. His determination and his dedication to ensure others do not experience the same loss is inspiring. President Trump has been clear. Hamas must release all 59 hostages immediately, including American citizens, Idan Alexander, Itai Chen, Judith Weinstein Haggai, Gad Haggai, and Omer Nutra, or they will continue to pay a steep price. We will always stand with Israel as it defends itself and pushes to secure the release of all hostages from Hamas captivity. Thank you, and I now turn the podium back to Ambassador Danon.
Thank you very much. We are all waiting to hear Eli in the Security Council in a few minutes, and we want to thank you and your brother Sharon for coming especially for this special event. Thank you very much.
The 9,882nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Khaled Khayari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia and Pacific, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Mr. Eli Sharabi. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Khaled Khayari.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council regarding the humanitarian situation faced by the remaining hostages in Gaza. I would like at the outset to recognize Mr. Eli Sharabi and his unimaginable experience of pain and his remarkable resilience in the face of such immense loss. I extend to him my condolences for the tragic loss of his dear family, wife, 2 daughters, and a brother. I pay him, all hostages, living and deceased, and their families and loved ones, my deepest respect and support. I again extend my deepest condolences to all the bereaved families who lost their family members and loved ones during and after the horrific attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023. The United Nations continue to unequivocally condemn the appalling acts of terror that took place on 7 October and continued holding of hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify the intentional killing, torture, sexual violence, and destruction. Entire families murdered, burned in their homes, taken hostage. The events of that horrific day will not be forgotten. The participation in Security Council meeting of surviving hostages and their heart-wrenching testimonies and many months of agony serve as a stark reminder, but also as a crucial symbol of endurance and hope for those still waiting to see their loved ones back home. Since the attacks, the Secretary General and other senior UN officials have regularly met with the families of hostages and have been deeply moved by their stories and by the torment and anguish they have endured. Madam President, the ceasefire and hostages release deal that took effect on 19 January offered a glimmer of hope and respite by reuniting 25 Israeli hostages with their loved ones and returning the remains of 8 deceased hostages who were killed on 7 October or while in captivity to their families. Their release and return were sadly also a moment of great anxiety, as most of the living hostages were paraded in front of crowds, and the coffins of the deceased, including those of 2 young children who were killed in captivity, were displayed publicly by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups during appalling ceremonies that violated international law. The United Nations has repeatedly condemned the parading of coffins containing the bodies of dead Israeli hostages and public displays accompanying the release of living and deceased hostages, including statements made under duress. As of today, at least 59 hostages, alive and deceased, including Eli's brother body, Yossi Sharabi, are still being held captive by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. The testimonies of those released provide terrifying accounts of their captivity, including physical and psychological torture, sexual violence, and deprivation, indicating that those left behind continue to suffer in horrific conditions, exposed to trauma and suffering since their abduction. The hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Until their release, they must be allowed to receive visits and support from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they must be treated with dignity and respect in line with humanitarian principles. Madam President, the resumption of hostilities on 18th of March adds further despair and uncertainty for those remaining hostages, their families, and their loved ones. This resumption of hostilities amidst significant Israeli airstrikes in Gaza has also been devastating for the civilian population in the Strip. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed, including women and children. Since the resumption of hostilities, one United Nations Office for Project Services, UNOPS, staff member has also been killed and several have been injured. Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency Lazzarini also informed that in the past few days, another 5 UNRWA staff have been confirmed killed. I reiterate that civilians must be protected, including personnel. The rights and dignity of all those affected by the conflict, whether in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, or elsewhere, must be respected and protected. We call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The return to hostilities threatens all civilians in Gaza. I echo the Secretary General's call for the resumption of serious negotiations, for the ceasefire to be respected, for unimpeded humanitarian assistance to be re-established, and for the remaining hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. With every passing day, we move further away from the objective of returning the remaining hostages safely to their homes. This was also very clear from the rescued hostages, Ms. Noah Argamini's remarks to the Council last month, where she told us that every moment under captivity was lived in danger. The resumed hostilities in Gaza, compounded with the lack of access and rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation, are exposing the remaining hostages to constant danger and life-threatening conditions. As Under-Secretary General Fletcher briefed you earlier this week, a renewed ceasefire is the best way of protecting civilians in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territory, and in Israel, releasing hostages and detainees and allowing aid and commercial supplies in. We remain steadfast in our commitment to protecting human rights, defending humanitarian principles, and supporting all efforts that promote peace, stability, and a more hopeful future for all people in the Middle East. We are also convinced that the only path to durable peace will be achieved when Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security, in line with international law and relevant UN resolutions, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. The United Nations stands ready to do all it can to support the parties in reaching that objective, and it will continue to do all it can to support an end to this suffering. Once again, I reiterate the Secretary General's deep concern for this conflict's unbearable impact on the victims and his urgent call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. Thank you, Madam President.
And I thank Mr. Ghayari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Eli Sharabi.
My name is Eli Sharabi. I am 53 years old. I've come back from hell. I've returned to tell my story. I used to live in Kibbutz Be'eri with my British-born wife, Liane, and my daughters, Noya and Yahel. It was a beautiful community. We were all passionate about creating the best life for our children and for our neighbors. At 16, I left Tel Aviv for Be'eri, seeking a peaceful home, away from the concrete city. I found a loving community and knew I would raise my family there. Many asked why we lived near Gaza, but to me, Be'eri was heaven. Liane came from Bristol, UK, as a volunteer. She was meant to stay a few months, but she met me and we fell in love. We were married for 23 years and had 2 wonderful daughters and a dog, Mocha. On October 7, my heaven turned to hell. Sirens began. Hamas terrorists invaded, and I was ripped away from my family, never to see them again. For 491 days, I was kept mostly underground in Hamas terror tunnels, chained, starved, beaten, and humiliated. I was held captive in the darkness, isolated from the world by Hamas terrorists. They took pleasure in our suffering. I survived on scraps of food with no medical attention and no mercy. When I was released, I weighed just 44 kilos. I had lost over 30 kilos, nearly half my body weight. For 491 days, I held on to hope. I imagined the life we would rebuild. I dreamed of seeing my family again. Only when I returned home, I learned the truth. My wife and my daughters had been slaughtered by Hamas terrorists on October 7. I'm here today, less than 6 weeks ago after my release, to speak for those still trapped in that nightmare. For my brother Yossi, murdered in Hamas captivity, his body still held hostage. For Alon Oel, still 50 meters underground, I swore to him that I would tell his story. For Hirsch, Ori, Eden, Carmel, Almog and Alexander, murdered in cold blood by their captors. For every hostage still in Hamas' hands, I'm here to tell you the whole truth. On the morning of October 7, at 6:29 a.m., the red alerts began to come through on Liane's phone. I told her not to worry. It will be over soon, I said. Minutes later, we heard that terrorists were infiltrating our community. They were inside the kibbutz. Again, I reassured her, the army will come. They always come. We heard gunfire, screaming, explosions, and then we heard the terrorists at our door. We had no weapons, no way to fight back. Liane and I made a decision we would not resist. We hoped we could save our daughter. The door opened, our dog barked, the terrorist opened fire. Liane and I threw ourselves over our daughters, screaming for the terrorists to stop. Suddenly, 10 terrorists were inside my home. They took our phones. 2 of them grabbed me. They took my wife and daughters to the kitchen. I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't know what was happening to them. I was screaming their names, and they were screaming mine. I told Liane not to be afraid, but this was fear beyond anything I've ever felt. Then I knew I was being taken. As they dragged me out, I called out to my girls, I will be back. I had to believe that. But that was the last time I ever saw them. I didn't know I should have said goodbye forever. Outside was like a war zone. My peaceful home, my slice of heaven, was gone. I saw over 100 terrorists filming themselves, celebrating, laughing, partying in our gardens as they massacred my friends and neighbors. They dragged me out, they dragged me to the border, beating me the whole way. My face was swollen, my ribs bruised. When we arrived in Gaza, a mob of civilians trying to lynch me. They pulled me from the car, but the terrorists rushed me away into a mosque. I was their trophy. I thought about Lian, Noya, and Yahel. Were they still alive? For the first 52 days, I was held in an apartment. I was tied up with ropes. My arms and legs were tied so tightly, the ropes tore into my flesh. I was given almost no food, no water, and I couldn't sleep. The pain was unbearable. Sometimes I would just faint from the pain, only to wake up to that pain again and again. Then, on November 27, 2023, Hamas took me into a tunnel, 50 meters underground. Again, the chains were so tight, they ripped my skin. They never took them off, not for a single moment. Those chains tore at me until the day I was released. Every step I took was no more than 10 centimeters. Every walk to the bathroom took an eternity. I cannot begin to describe the agony. It was hell. I was fed a piece of pita a day, maybe a sip of tea. Hunger consumed everything. They beat me. They broke my ribs. I didn't care. I just wanted a piece of bread. There was never enough food. Sometimes, if we begged enough, we would get something extra. We had to choose an extra piece of pita or a cup of tea. Sometimes they threw us dry dates, and it felt like the greatest gift in the world. We had to beg for food, beg to use the bathroom. Begging was our existence. We strategized over every meal. One day, I cut myself with a razor, just to make them believe I was injured. I collapsed on my way to the bathroom so they would think I was too weak and encourage them to give us more food. It worked. They gave us more food. We survived of those small victories. Do you know what it means to open a refrigerator? It is everything. To be able to reach and take a piece of fruit, an egg, a piece of bread. I dreamt of this simple act every day. For months, we lived like this. I stopped counting the days. Living as a hostage, you don't know how the day will begin, nor how it will end. Whether you live or die. At any moment, they could beat you. At any moment, they could kill you. You wake up every day and do not know when you will be able to eat. It could be 12 p.m., 5 p.m., 11 p.m. This would be the only meal we would have. You hope and pray that there will be no surprises with the captors. You think about how desperately you want to shower. We only got one bath a month with half a bucket of cold water. Toothpaste, toilet paper, forget it. Psychological terror was constant. Every day they told us, the world has abandoned you. No one is coming. By the time I met Alon Noel, who is now 24 years old, we had already endured terrible captivity. We relied on each other for survival. Alon is a very talented pianist, and I remember how he would pretend to play the piano on his body to keep himself sane. He doesn't look like anymore like that. One day, a terrorist took his anger out on me. He stormed in and beat me so badly that he broke my ribs. I couldn't properly breathe for a month. Alon tried to protect me with his own body. You couldn't believe how lucky I felt when Alon told me he had saved one painkiller pill. He gave it to me to get through the night. Alon still has shrapnel in his right eye from the day he was kidnapped. He never received medical care. He never saw the Red Cross. To this day, he is blind in that eye. When I was released, he grabbed onto me, terrified to be left behind. He told me he was happy for me. I promised him it was just a matter of days before we would be home too. I was wrong. Just before my release, Hamas took pleasure in showing me a picture of my brother Yossi. This is my oldest brother, husband for Nira, a father for Yuval, Ophir, and Oren. They told me he was dead. It was like they had brought a massive hammer down on me. I refused to believe it. My brother Yossi was all heart. Those with him in captivity told me that he gave his food to others. On February 8, 2025, I was released. I weighed 44 kilograms. This is less than the body weight of my youngest daughter, Yahel. May her memory be blessing. I was a shell of my former self. I still am. I couldn't believe how I looked. I stood at that Sikh Hamas ceremony, surrounded by terrorists and a crowd of so-called uninvolved civilians, hoping my wife and daughters were waiting for me. At the handover, I met a representative from the Red Cross. She told me, "Don't worry, you are safe now." Safe? How could I feel safe surrounded by terrorist monsters? Where had the Red Cross been for the past 491 days? Then I arrived home. They told me my mother and sister were waiting for me. I said, "Get me my wife and daughters." And that was when I knew. They were gone. They had been murdered. I'm here today because I survived and I prevailed. But that is not enough. Not when Alon Noel is still there. Not when 59 hostages are still there. Right now, Alon is trapped underground, alone, surrounded by terrorists who torment him. He doesn't know if he will ever see his mother, father, his entire beloved family again. I will not leave him behind. I will not leave anyone behind. Their time has almost run out. I'm here before you now to give my testimony and to ask, where was the United Nations? Where was the Red Cross? Where was the world? I know that you discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often, but let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government, feeding terrorists who tortured me and murdered my family. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it. When you speak of humanitarian aid, remember this. Hamas eats like kings, while hostages starve. Hamas steals from civilians. Hamas blocks aid from reaching those who truly need it. 491 days. That is how long I starved. How long I was chained. How long I begged for humanity. And in all that time, no one came. And no one in Gaza helped me. No one. The civilians in Gaza saw us suffering. They cheered our kidnappers. They were definitely involved. I was freed less than 6 weeks ago. I met President Trump at the White House and thanked him for securing my release and many others. I appreciate his efforts to free those still held hostage by Hamas. I told him, bring them all home. I met with Prime Minister Starmer at 10 Downing Street. I told him, bring them all home. Now, I'm here before you at the United Nations to say, bring them all home. No more excuses. No more delays. If you stand for humanity, prove it. Bring them home. My name is Eli Sharabi. I am not a diplomat. I am a survivor. Bring them all home. Now. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Sharabi for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And I want to thank also Assistant Secretary General Khiari for his briefing. The United States commends Eli Sharabi for his courage and for joining us today to provide searing, firsthand testimony to the depravity of Hamas. Thank you, Eli. Eli, I offer you our sincere condolences on the unspeakable loss you have suffered of your wife, Lian, and daughters, Noya and Yahel, as well as your brother, Yossi. May their memories be a blessing. The United States condemns Hamas in the strongest terms for these heinous murders. Your presence here in the face of the tragedy you have experienced is moving. Your brave testimony here is one of too many stories. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas brutally massacred almost 1,200 people and took over 250 hostages. The terrorist organization indiscriminately murdered infants and grandparents, partygoers, and Holocaust survivors. President Trump has been clear. Hamas must release all hostages immediately, or there will be hell to pay. 5 Americans still need to come home. Idan Alexander can still return to his parents' arms, but Hamas continues to hold the bodies of Itay Chen, Gadi Haggai, Judy Weinstein Haggai, and Omer Nutra, all brutally murdered in Hamas captivity. Another 54 are held in Hamas tunnels and must be released immediately. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war and the resumption of hostilities. Fighting could end tomorrow if Hamas released hostages and laid down its arms. As Secretary Marco Rubio put it, this is an outrage. The pillars of America's approach remain resolute. Stand with Israel, stand for peace. Madam President, Hamas has refused all attempts to extend the ceasefire in recent weeks, including a bridge proposal that would have provided calm beyond Ramadan and Passover and allowed time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. Madam President and colleagues, it has now been 530 days since Hamas started this horrific conflict, one that has upended so many lives and caused such immense suffering. We must recognize Hamas's savagery for what it is, the acts of a terrorist organization that purposefully committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It was Hamas that engaged in sexual violence toward hostages, released multiple hostages in a condition reminiscent of Holocaust survivors, and murdered and paraded the coffins of the Bibas children through the streets. And it is Hamas who is responsible for the resumption of hostilities, refusing time and time again to accept proposals to extend the ceasefire. We recognize Egypt and Qatar's interest in mediating negotiations, and we look forward to continued discussions with Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Hamas is an impediment to peace and has no right to speak on behalf of Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I will give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, ASG Chiari, for your briefing. The United Kingdom joined the US and France in calling for this important briefing. I would like to add my sincere gratitude to you, Ellie, for the courage you've shown today and every day since those horrific events of 7 October. The suffering you and your family have endured is beyond the imagination. Hamas must be held accountable for their despicable actions, including the murder of your wife, Leanne, a British national, and your 2 daughters. Your powerful testimony also serves as a reminder of the anguish that the remaining hostages held by Hamas continue to endure. This Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in all 4 of our resolutions since October 7. I repeat that call today. This includes the release of hostage of Nathan Orr and the return of deceased hostages Shay Levinson and Ellie's brother, Yossi Sharabi, who also have strong links to the UK. We also remain deeply concerned by the appalling treatment of hostages during their captivity, as we have heard from Ellie today, and the shocking images we have seen around their release. In its dedicated reports, the UN has concluded that there were reasonable grounds to suspect sexual violence occurred during the 7th October attacks. President, the UK is also deeply concerned at reports of sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinian detainees by Israeli forces. These allegations must be fully investigated. We reiterate our call for the International Committee of the Red Cross to be granted unfettered and immediate access to the hostages in Gaza and Palestinian detainees. Granting ICRC access is a clear obligation under international humanitarian law. The suffering in Gaza has gone on for far too long. Just yesterday, we heard the tragic news that a UN compound in Deir al-Balah was hit, killing and injuring humanitarian workers, including a British national. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. And as my Foreign Secretary has said, this appalling incident must be investigated transparently, and those responsible held to account. The protection of the UN and humanitarian workers is non-negotiable. And Israel must facilitate a rapid and unhindered resurgence in the flow of aid. We condemn the unacceptable statements from Defense Minister Katz warning of the total destruction of Gaza. President, both Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire deal in January, which provided for the release of all hostages through the 3 phases of the deal. With the Israeli airstrikes this week, which have killed so many Palestinian civilians, that deal has fallen apart. And with it, the best chance we had seen to return the hostages to their families and end the suffering. We call on the parties to urgently return to this deal, for the sake of the hostages and their families who continue to wait in agony for news of their loved ones, and for the sake of the Palestinians in Gaza, who have already suffered terribly. Diplomacy must be the way forward, not bloodshed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je remercie tout d'abord Monsieur le Sous-secrétaire général pour son exposé. Et je remercie Monsieur Eli Sharabi pour son témoignage poignant. À Genève, dans mes précédentes fonctions, j'ai eu le triste privilège de rencontrer souvent familles et proches des otages pour exprimer la solidarité de la France et sa détermination à aider à la libération de toutes et tous. Recevez, Monsieur Sharabi, l'expression de ma solidarité et de mon respect au nom de mon pays. Recevez nos condoléances les plus profondes pour la perte que vous avez subie, la perte de celle que vous aimiez. Sachez que nous sommes d'autant plus solidaires que des Français aussi ont été détenus. L'un est revenu, l'autre ne reviendra jamais. Madame la Présidente, jamais nous n'oublierons le traumatisme subi par les otages, leurs familles et le peuple israélien lors des attaques terroristes commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023, attaque qui constitue le pire massacre antisémite depuis la Shoah. Ce Conseil doit aussi les condamner d'une seule voix. Et la France continuera d'agir sans relâche pour la libération de tous les otages. Elle dénonce le calvaire qu'ils ont vécu, qu'ils vivent. Ces otages sont des civils innocents. Ils sont utilisés par le Hamas avec un cynisme et une cruauté confondantes. Ils ont été et sont détenus en captivité dans des conditions inhumaines, soumis à des actes de torture qui constituent autant de crimes sans nom. Jamais le Hamas n'a accepté de respecter les lois du droit humanitaire, que ce soit le respect de la dignité des personnes ou simplement l'accès du CICR aux otages comme ils en ont le devoir. Tous les otages doivent être libérés, c'est une priorité absolue. Ils doivent l'être dans la dignité et sans condition. Le Hamas doit mettre un terme aux traitements dégradants et humiliants infligés aux otages. La scénarisation de ces libérations, qui s'ajoute au traumatisme déjà subi, renvoie à des heures sombres de l'histoire. La France réitère sa solidarité sans faille avec les otages, leurs familles et leurs proches. Madame la Présidente, nous reconnaissons le droit d'Israël à protéger ses habitants. le devoir d'Israël d'assurer la protection de son pays et de son peuple. Nous reconnaissons le droit d'Israël à se défendre. Nous condamnons une nouvelle fois les récentes attaques à la roquette du Hamas contre Israël et nous condamnons sans aucune forme de restriction le recours du Hamas à la torture, à la violence aveugle. Mais est-ce en infligeant de nouvelles souffrances à la population palestinienne qu'Israël sera plus sûr ? La reprise des bombardements israéliens, au nom de la libération des otages, n'est pas la solution. Au contraire, et la France la condamne. Le blocus humanitaire à nouveau imposé par les autorités israéliennes à Gaza doit cesser. Par ailleurs, la France condamne l'attaque contre un bâtiment des Nations Unies dans la bande de Gaza le 19 mars, qui a causé la mort d'un employé d'UNIROPS et grièvement blessé plusieurs autres. Elle adresse ses condoléances aux proches de la victime et aux Nations Unies. Elle souhaite un prompt rétablissement aux blessés. Toute la lumière doit être faite sur les responsabilités de cet incident très grave. La protection du personnel humanitaire doit être garantie. Au-delà, nous appelons les parties à reprendre le chemin ouvert par l'accord de janvier. Libération sans condition de tous les otages dans la dignité. Reprise immédiate de l'aide humanitaire. Cessez-le-feu. Lancement des négociations de paix. Nous apportons tout notre soutien aux efforts des États-Unis, de l'Égypte, du Qatar, pour que soit retrouvé le chemin du cessez-le-feu. Et seul un règlement politique global du conflit israélo-palestinien permettra aux Israéliens et aux Palestiniens de vivre côte à côte, en paix et en sécurité. C'est dans cet esprit que la France prépare avec l'Arabie saoudite une conférence internationale en juin pour la mise en œuvre de la solution des deux États. Elle aura lieu ici à New York. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, thanks for giving me the floor. I begin by expressing our sincere appreciation to ASG Khiari for his briefings on this latest development. I also listened to Mr. Ali Sharabi's statement and wish to express my sincere condolence to him for the loss of his loved ones. And before proceeding further, I also want to express our deepest condolence for the tragic loss of UNOPS worker and extend our sympathies to those injured in the recent attacks. These attacks are unacceptable and must be thoroughly investigated, and we demand those responsible to be held accountable. We welcome the exchange of hostages and prisoners, allowing them to return to their families and regain their freedom. To demonstrate what can be achieved through dialogue and importance of continuing such engagement and mediation initiatives, we urge all parties to conduct the hostage and prisoner exchange process in full compliance with their international law obligations. Furthermore, we call on all parties to build on this momentum to commit to full implementation of the ceasefire in good faith. Madam President, our worst fears have materialized a few days ago. The situation in both Gaza and West Bank had deteriorated beyond our gravest concerns. The past 48 hours we witnessed the devastating escalation. Last night, the IDF strike hit multiple homes in the middle of the night, killing and injuring sleeping families, mainly women and children. This follows Tuesday's attack, where many of the casualties remain unaccounted for and still under the ruins of destroyed buildings. These attacks bring more death and destruction to an already traumatized civilian populations. The past 3 weeks have seen a profound rollback of humanitarian progress, with the delivery of aid at the scale effectively ended since March 2nd. Gaza has been cut off from the life-saving supplies, including fuel, food, electricity, and medicine. We must reiterate, Israel, as occupying power, has a clear obligation under the international law to ensure the civilians have access to essential goods and services, including humanitarian assistance. Madam President, As we are all aware, the blockade coincided with the holy month of Ramadan, has worsened an already dire situation in Gaza. Reports indicate only 1 out of 10 people in Gaza have access to clean water, and the only desalination plant have been forced to close due to electricity cut. We categorically condemn the use of starvation as a weapon of war and reject any attempt to leverage humanitarian aid as bargaining chip in the ceasefire negotiations. Such tactics constitute clear violation of international humanitarian law and human dignity. Equally alarming is the escalating violence in the West Bank, including the continued expansion of illegal settlement activities and forced displacement of the Palestinians from their homes. The international community must stand united against any attempts to alter the demographic composition or forcibly displace Palestinians from their camps and cities or annex any part of the West Bank or Gaza under any pretext. Such actions will constitute a grave violation of international law and amount to ethnic cleansing. Madam President, looking to the future, the path is clear. First, we must ensure unimpeded humanitarian access and address a severe underfunding of humanitarian response efforts, which currently stands at a mere of 4% of required resources. Second, we call for an immediate renewal of the ceasefire and cessation of all hostilities. All parties should commit to the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2735 in all its aspects and engage in good faith with mediationists from Egypt, Qatar, and United States toward the completion of the second and third phases of the ceasefire agreement. Last but not the least, the end of occupation and full recognition of free, sovereign, and independent Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with the relevant resolutions remains the only sustainable option to resolve this long-standing conflict. Madam President, to conclude, we reaffirm an unwavering commitment to the international law and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. The path forward requires our collective duty to immediate action to demand accountability, uphold justice, and work toward a future where Palestinian children no longer grow up under the shadow of war, but rather can live in peace, dignity, and prosperity in their land with their loved ones. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señora Presidente. Panamá saluda la convocatoria de esta sesión y agradece al subsecretario general para Medio Oriente, Asia y el Pacífico, Mohamed Khaled Kiari, por la información que ha compartido. Panamá también desea reconocer la presencia y la valentía del señor Eli Sharabi, cuya dramática experiencia refleja el profundo sufrimiento que este conflicto ha impuesto a tantas familias. Su conmovedora historia es un testimonio del inmenso costo humano de esta tragedia. Eli fue liberado tras 16 largos y dolorosos meses de cautiverio en Gaza, cuyos rigores nos acaba de describir. Pero, lamentablemente, no pudo regresar a su casa con su familia, porque su hogar había dejado de existir. Sin que él lo supiera, su esposa y sus hijas habían sido brutalmente asesinadas tras los inhumanos ataques de Hamas del 7 de octubre. Su hermano Yossi sigue desaparecido. Ese ataque, que marcó el inicio de esta tragedia humana, se cobró la vida de aproximadamente 1.200 personas y resultó en el secuestro de unas 250 personas. Al igual que Eli, 59 rehenes siguen privados de su libertad en Gaza, de los cuales se estima que solo 24 de ellos permanecen aún con vida, haciéndole frente a una realidad igualmente dolorosa e incluso peor. Estas personas no pueden seguir siendo víctimas del extremismo por parte de Hamás. Exigimos, una vez más, la liberación inmediata e incondicional de todos los rehenes que debieron haber sido liberados hace tiempo y que nunca debieron haber sido aprehendidos. Así como Eli Sharabi perdió a su familia y su hogar, miles de otras personas civiles en Gaza enfrentan hoy una realidad similar. Más de 49.000 muertos y decenas de miles de heridos. Los que han sobrevivido lo hacen en medio del dolor y la desesperación, enfrentando cada día la angustia de no tener acceso a alimentos, medicinas ni servicios básicos. Esta severa condición agrava cada día la vida de miles de inocentes que no pidieron ni merecen esta guerra. Tras semanas de relativa y frágil calma que ofreció un paréntesis de esperanza, la interrupción del alto al fuego el pasado 2 de marzo ha sumido nuevamente a la franja en una espiral de violencia, causando un aumento significativo en el número de víctimas que profundiza la prolongada crisis humanitaria y ha puesto en mayor riesgo la seguridad de la vida de los rehenes que permanecen en Gaza. No podemos olvidar a los 284 miembros del personal humanitario de Naciones Unidas que han perdido la vida en Gaza desde el 7 de octubre de 2023. Su valentía y dedicación, demostradas al continuar su labor pese a los enormes riesgos que enfrentan a diario, merecen nuestro más profundo reconocimiento. Panamá rinde homenaje a su entrega y reafirma su firme apoyo al trabajo invaluable que realizan en condiciones extremas para salvar vidas y aliviar el sufrimiento humano. Señora Presidente, Panamá considera que el pueblo palestino en Gaza merece un liderazgo comprometido con la paz, la seguridad y el respeto a los derechos humanos. Cualquier solución política que permita construir un futuro sostenible para Gaza debe estar libre de la influencia de quienes promueven la violencia y el extremismo. Esta espiral de violencia ha sido alimentada por años de desconfianza y decisiones que han dejado de lado la búsqueda genuina de la paz. Cada vez que se impone el extremismo sobre el entendimiento, se forma un nudo que estrangula con fuerza el sufrimiento de quienes menos culpa tienen, las poblaciones civiles. Ese nudo, alimentado por años de desconfianza y posturas intransigentes, se ha vuelto tan rígido que ahoga cualquier posibilidad de acuerdos y agrava aún más el dolor de inocentes. Cuando ese nudo revienta, no lo hace en silencio, estalla con el dolor desgarrador de madres, padres, hermanos e hijos que lloran en la desesperación de una pérdida irreparable. Es el triste eco de familias enteras, tanto israelíes como palestinas, que ven cómo sus vidas se desgarran una y otra vez por la violencia y el odio que se resiste a ceder. Señora Presidente, este conflicto no puede seguir el mismo camino. Es imperativo que se demuestre voluntad política constructiva, que afloje esa tensión y permita abrir caminos para la paz. En ese camino, Panamá tendrá su firme respaldo a la vía diplomática como la única opción para restaurar el alto al fuego que garantice la firme protección de los civiles y el personal humanitario, la liberación inmediata e incondicional de todos los rehenes y el acceso de ayuda humanitaria sin restricciones. Lograrlo requiere el respeto y cumplimiento de las resoluciones adoptadas por este Consejo y las normas internacionales que exigen tanto la liberación de los rehenes israelíes como el acceso humanitario a Gaza. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
主席，我感谢基亚利副秘书长的通报，我也感谢沙拉比先生的发言。我们对你的遭遇和失去亲人的痛苦表示同情。 15个月的冲突使加沙面目全非，使许多人遭受了难以承受的痛苦。我们衷心希望所有的痛苦都可以结束，希望所有人质和被扣押人员尽快获释，希望加沙恢复和平。但局势发展事与愿违。以色列从3月17日开始实施大规模空袭，在加沙重新挑起战火，使停火协议崩溃，制造了更多的痛苦和死亡。中方对此表示严重关切。把加沙置于炮火威胁之下，恐怕不会让人质更安全。事实上，我们听到一些人质家属也很担心，重开战火将让人质更加危险，希望维持停火，有利于人质早日回家。残酷事实已经证明，实现持久停火是拯救生命、让人质回家的最好方式。我们敦促以色列放弃使用武力的执念，停止对加沙的军事行动。希望停火协议的保障国秉持公正、负责任的态度，采取行动，推动停火协议3阶段连贯落实，在加沙实现持久停火。加沙民众在躲避战火的同时，正在遭受严峻的人道灾难和流离失所之苦。以色列先后切断加沙物资准入和电力供应，并在多地发布强制撤离令。这是对200万平民的实施的集体惩罚，没有任何正当理由。禁止人道物资进入加沙，可能也会使剩余的人质被剥夺生存下去的基本需求。以色列作为占领方，应该履行国际人道法义务，立即解除封锁，全面恢复加沙的人道物资准入。我们也重申反对任何针对联合国人员和人道工作者的袭击。主席，每个人的生命都是宝贵的，巴勒斯坦人民和以色列人民享有平等的生存权利和发展权利。巴以冲突几十年循环往复，让双方几代人生活在阴影之中。只有全面落实2国方案，实现巴勒斯坦独立建国，实现巴以2国和平共处，才能持久保障巴勒斯坦人民和以色列人民的安全和福祉。我们呼吁国际社会加大努力，推进落实2国方案的政治进程。中方将发挥建设性作用，为恢复中东地区和平，实现巴勒斯坦问题全面、公正、持久解决，做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank airstrikes for his detailed briefing. I also thank Mr. Eli Sharabi for your powerful testimony to your unspeakable suffering. And I'd like to convey my government, the Republic of Korea's deepest condolences for your loss of your beloved ones. Madam President, we still vividly remember the horror that shocked the entire globe on October 7, 2023, when a peaceful holiday morning in southern Israel suddenly changed into a nightmare. More than 1,200 Israeli citizens, including children, were brutally murdered by Hamas, and 251 innocent Israelis were forcibly kidnapped. These horrific terrorist attacks, unjustifiable under any excuse, left unforgettable trauma to Israelis. We once again repeat our strong condemnation on the terrorist attacks by Hamas on that dark day. As we speak now, 59 hostages, living or dead, are still held in Gaza. And we are frightened that more than 30 out of 59 hostages are presumed dead. The taking of hostages, as well as degrading treatment to them, is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. However, it is outrageous that hostages held by Hamas have experienced serious and extreme mistreatment, including being bound, starvation, and sexual violence. These indefensible crimes must be held accountable. There can be no impunity. Last month, we heard in this chamber another powerful testimony by the former hostage Ms. Noa Argamani. In her harrowing statement, she told us that the lives of the Israeli people cannot go on without those hostages still held in Gaza. Talking about her partner, who is still held by Hamas, she stressed that the deal must go on in full. We call on all parties to this conflict to pay the utmost attention to her desperate voice. With the renewed offensive in Gaza that started on Tuesday, we now hear once again the clear outcries of hostage families and released hostages, including Mr. Sharabi, who emphasized again and again, bring the remaining hostages home. Madam President, while we demand unconditional and immediate release of all hostages, we note that the most realistic way to ensure their safety and freedom is through the deal to secure the release of hostages and ceasefire in Gaza. Thus, we call on Israel to exercise restraint. Hamas must not endanger the lives of Palestinian civilians, and all parties should faithfully return to negotiations. The Republic of Korea appeals to all parties to this conflict to prioritize alleviating the suffering of civilians and protecting them. We commend the ongoing efforts by mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, and count on them once again for securing the ceasefire and the release of all hostages. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank ASG Khaled Khiari for his briefing. We also listened carefully to the representative of the civil society. Consistent with the universal human rights, no civilian, irrespective of their background, should endure suffering. Every innocent life matters. Consistency is a fundamental principle in international relations. A selective, cherry-picking attitude toward international law, particularly international humanitarian law, is not acceptable. For a country to uphold its international obligations and contribute positively to global stability, it must obey the legal frameworks that govern human rights and humanitarian activities. Algeria, as a serious member of the international community, firmly respects and upholds all its international obligations. We firmly believe that the law is the cornerstone of international law. Without adherence to international law, we risk descending into a jungle where might make right and injustice prevails. Regrettably, this is precisely what we witness today. In the occupied Palestinian territories, what we see unfolding before us is not the rule of law, but rather an environment where no rules are respected, and basic human dignity is disregarded. Humanitarian access, you can block it. Children, women, and elderly, you can massacre them. And workers, UN staff, journalists, and medical staff, you can target and kill them. These are the new rules that have been established in Gaza. Madam President, since October the 7th, members of this Council have constantly adopted resolutions calling for the release of all hostages. We have easily reached agreement on this matter, but we have failed to achieve one crucial call: the immediate and permanent ceasefire. Today, this is the cause of the suffering endured by all people in Gaza. The failure to impose this essential measure prolonged the pain and devastation in Gaza, the pain on all sides. Madam President, international humanitarian and human rights law guarantees the rights of individuals in captivity, ensuring their dignity and human treatment. Moreover, the principle of non-reciprocity, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, prohibits revenge or retaliation. Even during times of conflict, the protection of human dignity must remain a priority. Suffering cannot justify another suffering. However, it is with great regret that we observe the Israeli occupying powers' blatant disregard for these fundamental principles. To illustrate this, first, over 9,500 Palestinians are currently detained in Israeli prisons, with more than 3,400 held under administrative detention, without charges or trial. Why are these individuals arrested? What legal ground justify their detention? Second, since October 7th, the Israeli occupying authorities have cut off all cooperation with the ICRC, rendering detainees disappeared. Third, one of the most grotesque violations involves the Israeli practice of holding the bodies of dead Palestinians. Before October 7th, the number of such bodies was estimated at approximately 400, some dating back as far as the 80s. Today, the number exceeds 600. Madam President, the international community must come together to ensure full compliance with international law. Double standards and selective enforcement of these principles are unacceptable. The law must be upheld universally, without exception, to protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of their nationality or the conflict they find themselves in. Only by holding all parties to the same legal standards can we hope to bring an end to the suffering and build a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, we thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Keri for his briefing to the Council this morning. We have also heard with sympathy the statement of Mr. Sharabi and commiserate with him on the loss of his family. Madam President, civilians have been the central victim of the current war in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. Hostage-taking is prohibited under international law and constitutes a violation of fundamental humanitarian principles. The protection of civilians must be ensured in full compliance with international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. However, international law must be applied uniformly, universally, and consistently. The issue of the humanitarian violations must encompass the plight of the thousands of Palestinians who have suffered during this war. We cannot forget the thousands of Palestinians, including women and children, who remain arbitrarily detained, subjected to torture, and held in inhumane conditions in Israeli prisons. Many have lost their lives due to mistreatment and medical neglect. Our colleague from Algeria has just outlined this suffering of Palestinian detainees. The international community must not turn a blind eye to their suffering. Justice and human rights cannot be applied selectively. For illustration, the recent report of the Commission of Inquiry stated that Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence since October 7, 2023, and it found, and I quote, Israeli forces have committed the crime against humanity of persecution based on gender. Madam President, we must turn to ending the suffering in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and in the region. The ceasefire agreement facilitated by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States offered a glimmer of hope. It led to the release of hostages and temporarily alleviated the suffering of the Palestinian people. Yet, tragically, this opportunity was sabotaged by the political interests of some Israeli politicians who prioritized their survival through the continuation of the war. We condemn the resumption of Israel's attacks on Gaza and the indiscriminate killing of Palestinian civilians through bombardments through the air as well as artillery. We also deplore the killing of the UNOPS official and the UNRWA members and commiserate with their families. And we must ask whether this resumption of war is good for the hostages. Is it good for the Palestinians? Certainly not. The ongoing attacks, blockade, mass displacement, and relentless bombardment have created an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. The Palestinians are being killed indiscriminately and with impunity. This is not the way to secure the release of the hostages. Madam President, Pakistan reiterates its urgent call for the full and immediate resumption and implementation of the ceasefire agreement in all its phases. This must include permanent cessation of hostilities, the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, unrestricted humanitarian access, and a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Gaza. We support the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735. This would be the best way to secure the release of the hostages. Madam President, while Pakistan supports all efforts to alleviate human suffering and ensure the humane treatment of all civilians, we must not lose sight of the root cause of this endless cycle of violence and suffering. Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, its persistent violations of international law, and its indiscriminate military actions against the innocent and helpless people of Gaza continues to fuel instability and conflict in the Middle East. We saw some hope in the proposed Arab and OIC plan for recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. It offered a realistic path to peace. We believe that this path must be reinstated. A just and lasting peace can only be achieved through the revival of a credible and irreversible political process towards a two-state solution, leading to the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state within the pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. The upcoming June conference, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, presents an important opportunity to advance the peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question and to implement the two-state solution in accordance with international law and UN resolutions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing and Mr. Sharabi for moving account of his horrific experience. We are glad to see you well, and we express our condolences for your loss. Colleagues, those who follow Council's deliberation in details will have noticed that Slovenia's tone evolved. But we have always, every single time, advocated for respect for international law, the unconditional release of hostages, the protection of Palestinian civilians, an immediate ceasefire, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. We have consistently claimed that people trapped in Gaza cannot continue to endure this terrible suffering, let them be Israeli hostages or Palestinian civilians. We always defended Council's action, also to ensure release of hostages. I want to recall the Resolution 2728, drafted by the 10 elected members and adopted by this Council last March. It contains a clear demand, quote, for immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, end of quote. Colleagues, we once again condemn terrorist attacks on October 7 and hostage-taking by Hamas and other armed groups. We are appalled by this violation of international law. Every hostage needs to return home and rejoin with their loved ones. They need to feel again the warmth of the sunlight. And ultimately, they need to see accountability for violations and abuses perpetrated against them, including those against Mr. Sharabi. During recent ceasefire, 25 hostages were released and the remains of 8 were returned. We welcome every life freed. We were devastated following the return of remains of those who died in custody, in captivity, in particular the Bibas family. We deeply regret that the negotiations to secure the release of the rest of hostages have not continued, and the process of finding a peaceful solution through dialogue has stalled. Will cutting electricity, halting humanitarian aid,
or intensifying military operations truly bring the remaining hostages home alive? Or will that put them in additional danger? We disagree that the return to fighting was a necessity. War is never a necessity, but a choice. There is no military solution to any conflict, and neither is to the one in Gaza. It is only peace that would bring hostages home sooner. The best option for them to enjoy freedom again is respecting the ceasefire agreement in line with Resolution 2735. We support it and joined the appeal by hostage Noah Argamani made here in the Council chamber a month ago for the deal to go on in full and completely in all the stages. We therefore once again thank and appeal to mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, to continue their tireless engagement. And we urge Hamas and Israel to return to negotiations table in good faith. Madam President, I would like to extend our condolences to all families and friends of hostages that have lost their loved ones. All remaining hostages need to be released immediately. This is our demand that we continue to voice since October 7. Hostages should be treated with humanity and with respect for the inherent human dignity, including during their release. The ICRC must be granted access to them. I repeat, suffering of hostages should never be a bargaining chip. Neither should humanitarian aid ever be weaponized. Finally, we fundamentally disagree with the notion that the loudest voices on human rights lost their voice. Not all of us. Slovenia proudly stands for human rights and protection of all civilians in all situations. And with this in mind, we cannot accept that the war in Gaza continues to be fought by sacrificing lives of Israeli hostages, Palestinian civilians, as well as humanitarian workers. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Kiari for his important briefing. I also thank Mr. Eli Sharabi for his bravery in sharing his compelling personal and tragic testimony with us. Our deepest condolences on the loss of your family. We acknowledge the letters dated 14th and 18th March 2025 from the Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations regarding the plight of the hostages and their tragic humanitarian situation. As this Council focuses on hostage-taking today, one undeniable reality of this ongoing conflict in Gaza Strip is its devastating toll on civilians, both in Israel and in Gaza. Since the attack on 7th October 2023, hostages and civilians have endured extreme suffering with severe humanitarian consequences. The unacceptable attack resulted in the abduction by Hamas and other armed groups of 250 individuals, men, women, and children, ranging in age from 9 months to 85 years. Categorically, this act constitutes a grave violation of international law. Article 34 of the Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits hostage-taking. This prohibition has crystallized into a rule of customary international law, as recognized by the International Committee of the Red Cross in a study on customary international humanitarian law under Rule 96. While the first phase of the ceasefire led to the release of 38 hostages, some of whom tragically perished in captivity, we remain deeply concerned that 59 individuals are still being held hostage. Their condition, medical needs, and access to humanitarian aid are unknown, with the ICRC still being denied access. In light of the unimaginable pain and suffering endured by hostages and their families, Sierra Leone reiterates its firm and unequivocal demand for their immediate and unconditional release, as previously called for by this Council in Resolution 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We note the endorsement in this Council in Resolution 2735 of the agreed terms for the release of Palestinian detainees, and also call for the release of thousands of Palestinians detained in the State of Israel without trial, access, or proper care, in violation of international law and their fundamental rights and dignity. We emphasize that the release of hostages and detainees must be conducted with dignity, and the ICRC must be granted immediate access in accordance with international humanitarian law to provide medical and humanitarian assistance. As we extend our deepest sympathies to the families of all victims of this conflict, including the hostages, we stress the importance of investigating violations, including allegations of mistreatment and abuse of hostages and detainees. Accountability must be ensured for all grave violations committed in the context of this conflict, including those arising from the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories. Madam President, as the Security Council convenes to address yet another tragic aspect of its decades-long conflict, the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, and the 7th October 2023 escalation, reports indicate that the Israeli defensive forces have carried out pre-dawn attacks in northern and southern Gaza, killing over 70 Palestinians, including women and children. This comes just one day after more than 400 Palestinians, including 183 children, were killed following the government of Israel breach of the ceasefire. As briefed by ASG Chiari, 1 UNOPS and 5 UNRWA staff members were also killed. As a council, we must continue to collectively work to end this conflict. This layer of tragedies, we must support efforts to protect civilians in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, and strive relentlessly towards a peaceful and sustainable resolution of this conflict. The recent post-ceasefire escalation of violence has already resulted in hundreds of casualties, and continued diplomatic engagement is essential to return to the ceasefire agreement and address outstanding issues. In closing, we must reiterate that hostage-taking is a grave violation of international law, and it triggers responsibilities for armed groups, states, and the international community. It demands immediate action for the protection, release, and legal accountability of all those involved. We also reiterate our call for a just and lasting political solution to this conflict, the immediate and full restoration of humanitarian aid access, respect for international law, and the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and a resolution that ensures security and coexistence for both Israelis and Palestinians, living side by side in peace and tranquility. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I also wish to thank ASG Khaled Chiari for his briefing, as well as Mr. Eli Sharabi for his testimony here today. Madam President, 531 days have passed since Hamas launched a brutal terrorist attack on Israel. Greece immediately condemned this attack, as well as the cruel treatment of all hostages kept in captivity in terrible and inhumane conditions. Today, 59 hostages remain still in Hamas's captivity, 24 of whom are believed to be alive. The tragic story of Eli Sharabi is a sheer reminder that this war must end now. We extend our deepest and most heartfelt condolences to him for the tragic loss of beloved family members, as well as to the families of victims and hostages. We reiterate our call for all hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. Dramatic stories like the one of Noah Ragamanis, whose partner is still in captivity, are mere reflections of the scale of pain still endured by survivors in captivity and their loved ones. Likewise, the heartbreaking fate of the Bibas family highlights the urgent need to bring the agony and suffering to an end. Our thoughts remain with them. Madam President, the long-awaited ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza was a great example of what could be achieved through political will and opportunity to replace despair with hope for a better future. Hope on the horizon became visible when Israeli families were given the chance to finally rejoin their loved ones and Palestinian people were finally able to stop counting their dead. In this respect, we are very concerned with the resumption of hostilities in Gaza and the high toll on civilians. It is necessary to resume negotiations for the ceasefire renewal immediately so as to ensure the release of remaining hostages and to protect the lives of the civilian population in Gaza. Madam President, the world cannot or should not forget neither the lives taken as a result of the horrendous terrorist attack on October 7, nor the lives of the remaining hostages. At the same time, we cannot or should not forget that the war in Gaza has left behind thousands of Palestinians dead, injured, separated from their families, and internally displaced. The humanitarian crisis on the ground cannot be ignored. Millions are in urgent need of primary health services, education, and shelter. Safe, unconditional, massive, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale to the people of Gaza must be ensured. We share the grief for the UNOPS staff member who died during the strike at the UN gas house in Gaza and offer our condolences to his family in the UN. Border crossing points must remain open. UNRWA's role should not be undermined. Civilians and humanitarian workers must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the political process must be revitalized with the aim of achieving a two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolution, while recognizing the right of Israel to exist in peace and security. In this way, we look forward to the international conference to be held in June here in New York under the stewardship of France and Saudi Arabia as co-chairs. We welcome regional efforts to cohere around a single plan for the next phase in Gaza, and we stand ready to support and develop these ideas further. The Arab plan for the reconstruction of Gaza is a constructive proposal on the table and could help accelerate discussions on reconstruction, post-conflict planning, and on the day after. It is a good starting point which requires further engagement with Egypt and other key Arab players. Madam President, the circle of violence must end now and the hostages must be released without delay. It is evident by now that this conflict has no military solution. As we have stressed before, there can be no day-after scenario for the Gaza Strip with Hamas in power or in any position to threaten Israel. We cannot change the past, but we can start now and lay the foundation for the future. The suffering of both sides must come to an end. Neither the hostages and their families nor the Palestinians can afford to pull back from the ceasefire agreement. The deal must hold. Therefore, it is crucial for the parties to return to the table of negotiations and proceed to the next phase in good faith. Time is running out. The time to act is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, госпожа председатель. Благодарим помощника генсекретаря Халида Хияри за обстоятельный брифинг по ситуации, складывающейся вокруг заложников, удерживаемых в секторе Газа. Со скорбью в сердце выслушали трагическую историю Эли Шараби, потерявшего всю свою семью. Подобная жестокость не имеет оправдания. Выражаем вам наши искренние соболезнования. Скорбим также по всем без исключения погибшим в результате продолжающейся без малого 18 месяцев эскалации. Этот нескончаемый и порочный круг насилия необходимо, наконец, разорвать. Невыносимые страдания мирных жителей в зоне палестино-израильского конфликта не могут никого оставить равнодушным. Именно поэтому 19 января международное сообщество приветствовало установление режима прекращения огня между Израилем и Хамас, которое не только приостановило спираль насилия, унесшую жизни более 49 тысяч человек, но и привело к долгожданному освобождению удерживаемых в Газе заложников и содержащихся в израильских тюрьмах палестинцев. В ходе первого этапа сделки Израилю было передано 25 заложников, а также 8 тел в обмен на почти 1800 палестинских заключенных. Кроме того, за 42 дня тишины у жителей Газы, включая остающихся в заложниках израильтян, появилась надежда на спасение. Доступ в анклав был разблокирован. гуманитарная деятельность активизировалась, и структуры ООН рапортовали о наращивании гумпоставок на территорию анклава. Весь мир вздохнул с облегчением. Однако с приближением даты окончания первого этапа договоренности о прекращении огня перспективы дальнейшей реализации сделки оказались под вопросом. С первого дня перемирия руководство Израиля последовательно наращивало воинственную риторику при сохранении присутствия формирований армии обороны Израиля в секторе. Переход ко второй фазе сделки, предполагающей постоянное прекращение огня и освобождение всех остающихся в Газе заложников, видимо, даже не рассматривался. Вместо этого израильские власти, вопреки достигнутым при помощи посредников договоренностям, упорно продвигали идеи исключительно технического продления перемирия в целях возвращения всех заложников. Ситуация долгое время оставалась подвешенной. Однако окно возможностей на перезапуск комплексного процесса мирного регулирования все-таки захлопнулось 18 марта, когда авиация армии обороны Израиля возобновила авиаудары по территории сектора, в результате чего были убиты более 420 человек, в том числе сотрудники ЮНОПС. Еще 5 сотрудников ООН получили ранения. Как заявил генсекретарь ООН, общее число погибших 7 октября 2023 года ООНовцев составило по меньшей мере 280 человек. Присоединяемся к решительному осуждению генсекретарем нападений на персонал Всемирной организации и его призыву к проведению полноценного расследования данного инцидента. Госпожа председатель, мы с глубоким сожалением восприняли возобновление Израилем военных действий в секторе Газа. Причем, насколько мы можем судить, речь идет не только о воздушных налетах, но и о наземной операции. Решительно осуждаем любые действия, которые ведут к гибели мирных граждан и дальнейшему разрушению социальной инфраструктуры. Обескураживает и поступающая информация о неизбирательных атаках израильской авиации по району Маваси, ранее объявленному израильтянами гуманитарной зоной безопасности для эвакуации с территории анклава всех нуждающихся в неотложной помощи. В итоге, сегодня мы узнали и о возобновлении обстрелов из Газа израильских городов, включая Тель-Авив, что было весьма предсказуемо, ведь насилие порождает насилие. Параллельно Израиль возобновил полную блокаду сектора Газа, прекратив подачу воды и электроэнергии, несмотря на очевидную угрозу для жизни и безопасности тех, кто там находится, в том числе остающихся в заложниках израильтян. Такое решение представляет собой грубейшее нарушение международного гуманитарного права и может трактоваться как военное преступление. Проблема выживания, с которой сталкиваются палестинцы, осложняется критической ситуацией вокруг функционирования БАПОР, которая является ключевой структурой по комплексному содействию палестинцам. Закручивая гайки в секторе Газа, руководство Израиля одновременно продолжает неправомерные шаги, включая военную операцию на западном берегу реки Иордан. Завтра у нас будет возможность обсудить эту тему подробно. Госпожа председатель, сегодня мы с крайним разочарованием вынуждены констатировать, что прекращение огня, которого мы все так долго добивались, оказалось неустойчивым. Сложно говорить о его дальнейших перспективах, когда израильское военно-политическое руководство открыто заявляет о намерении действовать против Хамас с возрастающей силой и вести дальнейшие переговоры по сделке исключительно под огнем. Выбор в пользу войны, похоже, уже сделан. И кто знает, сколько новых жертв ждет Палестину и Израиль впереди. Полагаем, что хрупкость только что нарушенных Израилем договоренностей объясняется еще и тем, что Совет Безопасности ООН с самого начала было мало что известно насчет деталей переговорного процесса по сделке. Ведь Совет был изначально от нее целенаправленно отсечен, и весь акцент делался на усилиях других посредников. Соответственно, оказался невостребован и весь имеющийся у ООН для этого специальный инструментарий, задействование которого могло бы обеспечить устойчивый характер прекращения огня. Важно, чтобы те, кто будет работать над восстановлением перемирия в секторе, отдавали себе в этом отчет. Несмотря на новое обострение палестино-израильского конфликта, мы убеждены, что его дипломатическое решение не только возможно, но и является единственной реалистичной опцией. Призываем израильскую и палестинскую стороны при содействии посредников вернуться за стол переговоров с целью выработки взаимоприемлемого компромиссного решения проблемы удерживаемых лиц, возвращения к режиму прекращения огня и возобновлению полноценного гуманитарного доступа. Это позволило бы обеспечить устойчивую нормализацию в секторе Газа и запустить полномасштабное восстановление палестинского анклава. Уверены, что это именно то, чего желают как мирные палестинцы, так и родные и близкие остающихся в Газе заложников, включая уроженца Донбасса Максима Харкина. Важно, чтобы к этому стремились все регионалы и международное сообщество в целом. Процесс палестино-израильского урегулирования должен быть возвращен в политическое русло, с тем, чтобы были удовлетворены как законные озабоченности Израиля в сфере безопасности, так и чаяния палестинцев на обретение собственного государства в границах 1967 года. Мы готовы работать над этой задачей в Совете Безопасности вместе с теми, кто разделяет этот подход. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam Chair, Madam President, actually, thank you for convening today's meeting. I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing, and I take this opportunity to extend to him and the UN family our deepest condolences on the killing of the 6 UNOPS and UNRWA workers over these last few days. I also commend Mr. Sharabi for his courage in sharing his experience with us today and commiserate with him on the loss of his loved ones in such tragic circumstances. Madam President, at the outset, Guyana stresses that the taking of hostages is a grave breach of international law, particularly Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. In this context, we condemn once again the taking of hostages by Hamas during the 7th October attacks on Israel and emphasize the provisions of Security Council's resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735, which call for the release of all hostages. We further stress the imperative of ensuring humanitarian access to these individuals to attend to their medical and other needs. Guyana also emphasizes the obligation of parties to ensure that the remains of anyone who died while being held hostage or detained are handled with dignity and respect. Madam Chair, in the context of the foregoing, allow me to underscore the following 3 points. First, there must be an immediate end to the ongoing hostilities in Gaza to create the conditions for peace, recovery, and for a lasting, just, and comprehensive end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As Guyana has consistently emphasized, recurring cycles of violence between the two sides only hurt the prospects for a lasting peace and place both Palestinian and Israeli civilians at continued risk of harm, including death. It is therefore important to address the factors driving occurrences, such as those witnessed on 7th October. In this context, Guyana recalls member states' commitment, as elaborated in the UN's Global Counterterrorism Strategy, to, and I quote, address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, including but not limited to prolonged, unresolved conflicts, dehumanization of victims of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, lack of the rule of law, and violations of human rights, ethnic, national, and religious discrimination, political exclusion, socioeconomic marginalization, and lack of good governance, while recognizing that none of these conditions can excuse or justify acts of terrorism, end of quote. Efforts to combat terrorism must continue to take these important factors into account. Second, the Security Council must be at the forefront of efforts to address breaches of international law, which have implications for the maintenance of international peace and security. Given its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Council should be the first to demand accountability for such breaches. It must also be first to institute measures in keeping with the scope provided by the UN Charter to address violations of international law, including in circumstances where those violations feature as the taking of hostages or the administrative detention of innocent civilians. Accountability is an important deterrent. Third and final, the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict calls for principled consistency. By this, I mean that there must be principled and consistent application of international law and principled and consistent responses to wrongdoing. The approach to this conflict should not be determined by convenience based on present circumstances, because this presents the risk of acting from expediency rather than principle. Guyana therefore appeals to this Council and to all Member States to consistently adopt a principled approach to the Palestinian question as we collectively seek to advance a lasting solution. Madam President, allow me to conclude by reiterating the need to bring a definitive end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which keeps manifesting in cycles of violence that produce volumes of hurt to both sides. Let us work to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring home the remaining men, women, and children, which Hamas took hostage from Israel, and the Palestinians detained in Israeli jails without charge, and to end the aid blockade on Gaza, which is once again stifling Palestinian civilians. Guyana is prepared to do its part to this end in compliance with international law. I thank you.
And I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. Mr. Sharabi, thank you for your courageous testimony today. Words are not enough to express our condolences for your loss. No one should be forced to endure what you and your loved ones have gone through. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Khiari for your important briefing. Denmark reiterates once again its firm condemnation of the heinous terrorist attacks on October 7 by Hamas against Israel. We re-emphasize that hostage-taking is a war crime and that the actions of Hamas pose a clear threat not only to Israel but to international peace and security. Today, we express our deepest solidarity and grief with all those affected by the hostage taken on October 7th. Our thoughts are with all those that are still held in Gaza, those who came out but are traumatized for life, those who were killed in Hamas captivity, and those whose fate is still uncertain. Amongst those killed is a Danish-Israeli hostage, who we also mourn here today. We reiterate our demand for the immediate, unconditional, safe, and dignified release of the remaining hostages. We also regret that the hostages have not been granted any humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs as required under international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. Colleagues, there's been far too much suffering since October 7th. Suffering of Israelis, in particular those brutally killed or taken hostage, as well as their loved ones. And suffering of civilian Palestinians. More than 50,000 people have lost their lives, most of whom civilians. It is time to break the cycle of violence. We deplore the breakdown of the ceasefire and the subsequent resumption of the Israeli airstrikes and renewed ground operations in Gaza, with further devastation of the civilian population. Over the past few days, there are reports of hundreds of killed. We deeply regret the death of a UNOP staff member and echo the Secretary General's condemnation of all attacks on UN personnel. We call on Israel to live up to its obligations under international law, including the resumption on unimpeded entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and ensure that the basic needs of the civilian populations are met. In closing, the suffering we are witnessing on all sides is immense, and the urgency to bring about peace cannot be overstated. Denmark stands firm in our call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages and for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, imperatives that can only be achieved through resumed negotiations. It is our hope that progress on this front will open the pathway towards a two-state solution. For the sake of those who have suffered, both those in Gaza and those such as Mr. Sharabi, and for those future generations of Israelis and Palestinians who deserve to live in peace. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representatives of the United States have asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I wanted to respond on behalf of the United States, having listened to some of the statements made by others around the Council, on 3 points, if I may. On humanitarian aid, getting into Gaza, I would just reiterate the position that we have articulated, that nobody wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry or thirsty, and that we are working tirelessly to resolve this crisis. With respect to the report issued by the Commission of Inquiry cited by some in the Council today on alleged sexual violence by the IDF, I would point out that this report conflates the acts of a few who will be reprimanded by Israel with the full-fledged sexual violence campaign orchestrated by Hamas on October 7th, and that is disgraceful. With respect to the allegation that Israel is engaging in indiscriminate strikes, the United States would remind Council members that Israel is targeting Hamas leaders and operatives who continue to use civilian infrastructure and hide among the civilian population. And the Council must condemn this practice. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Khiari for his briefing and to convey through him our condolences and solidarity for the UN staff members killed and injured, some sustaining life-altering injuries and amputation, while they were in UN premises as a result of Israeli bombardment yesterday, and others who were killed recently from UNRWA, as Mr. Lazzarini has informed us. These victims were upholding the UN's most noble mission, trying to save lives. And as all humanitarians, they are having to do so at the peril of their lives. They were upholding the mandate conferred to them by this Council in its Resolution 2720. They are entitled to protection as Palestinian civilians are entitled to protection, and both are being blatantly deprived of it. This demonstrates yet again the indiscriminate nature of Israeli attacks. Allow me also to acknowledge the testimony of Eli Sharabi and present our condolences for his loss. Maybe no one around this table can fully grasp what such a loss means: the killing of loved ones, prolonged captivity, fear and trauma. But Palestinians, us, can. We understand this pain because we live it. They endure it every day. Entire families obliterated in massive and indiscriminate bombardments. Children shot by Israeli snipers in the head and in the chest. Communities uprooted by force. There is not a single Palestinian family that does not have a loved one killed, wounded, detained, or displaced. And they have been enduring these horrors and injustices for decades, even though they reached an unprecedented scale in the last year and a half. When confronted with such loss, either we pursue justice or vengeance. Justice ends suffering. vengeance perpetuated. Madam President, we will not accept incitement against Palestinian civilians. We will not accept excuses for their killing and maiming and torture. We will not accept justification for collective punishment. We saw Israelis calling for and cheering on genocide. We saw Israelis signing bombs to be dropped on the heads of Palestinian families. We saw Israelis block humanitarian aid to a starving population. We saw Israelis attack innocent Palestinians. But we do not attribute these acts generically to Israeli civilians, nor do we use these actions as justification for indiscriminate killing and maiming and for dehumanizing and punishing millions of people. We have a right to life too, a right to liberty and dignity, a right to live in peace in our ancestral land. Till when will our people have to suffer from the inability to see Palestinians as equals, to acknowledge their suffering and their loss, to remember that around 1 million Palestinians have experienced captivity, that many died while in Israeli jails, killed or left to die? Not a single Palestinian family did not have a Palestinian that visited Israeli jails. Not a single Palestinian family. Israel arrests our children, our doctors, our teachers, our workers, family members, bystanders, parliamentarians, academics, human rights defenders. Israel considers all Palestinians guilty. All Palestinians guilty. Till when will people pretend they do not see the images of Palestinians coming out of Israeli captivity looking like ghosts, starved and traumatized, beaten and some raped? Till when Israel will pretend it bears no responsibility in the crimes it commits? Till when our humanity and our rights will be denied? We have to note that usually the ones who suffered most on both sides have been among the most passionate advocates for a ceasefire for over a year now. Those who suffer the most, they have solidarity with each other. Their calls should be heeded, as many of you referred to another victim that gave testimony to us, and she asked for the ceasefire to be defended and the 3 stages of the agreement to be implemented. Listen to her. Their calls should be heeded. Their suffering should not be used to inflict more death and devastation or as an excuse for perpetual war, genocide, forced displacement and annexation, dehumanization and hate. The suffering of all civilians must end. All civilians. We have a duty to end the occupation and conflict and to ensure life prevails, to ensure liberty prevails, to ensure shared peace and security prevail, if we truly care about the victims and about our peoples. Madam President, in 42 days, many more hostages were released than in 15 months of indiscriminate bombardments. If Netanyahu truly cared about the hostages, he would not have shattered the ceasefire that was allowing for their release. If anyone needed more evidence that Netanyahu could care less about the fate of the hostages, his decision to resume attacks against Gaza is the ultimate proof. All Israel had to do was move forward in implementing the ceasefire. Everyone knows this truth, starting with the families of the hostages themselves, who are still demonstrating to stop the bloodshed and restore the ceasefire. Killing innocent Palestinian civilians by the hundreds each day, forcibly displacing our population with the clear aim of annexing our land and ending our national identity has nothing to do with hostages or security. It has everything to do with the attempt to destroy the Palestinian people as the means to seize their land. Madam President, the Israeli Minister of War addressed what he called the residents of Gaza, saying, and I quote, "Soon the evacuation of the population from combat zones will resume, and what follows will be far more severe. You will pay the full price, return the hostages and remove Hamas. The alternative is total devastation." End of quotation. After having confessed to weaponizing humanitarian aid, Israel is also confessing to its policy of collective punishment, indiscriminate attacks, and of wanton destruction and devastation. The Israeli government cannot speak of humanity nor denounce barbarism, not when it kills 400 Palestinians in one night, including over 150 children, representing one of the largest single-day child death toll in the last year. Not when it killed 50,000 Palestinians, maimed over 100,000 Palestinians, and destroyed the lives of 2 million people. Not when it is starving our people. Not when it is forcibly displacing them. Not when it is abducting thousands and subjugating them to torture and beating and degrading treatment and sexual violence. Not when it is detaining the corpses of hundreds of Palestinians, denying their families the right to provide their loved ones dignified burial. Israel considered it is barbarism only if it attributes to the act of Hamas, but it is justified if it is committed by Israel. It is barbarism if the act is against an Israeli, and it is legitimate if the act is against a Palestinian. Look at this, despicable, double standard. Israel has a right to kill and maim, to arbitrarily detain and torture, to displace and destroy and devastate, and we have the right to die and disappear. That is not how international law works. There are prohibited actions regardless of the identity of the perpetrators and regardless of the identity of the victims. There are protections afforded to all civilians regardless of the nationality, religion, and race. These prohibitions and protections must be upheld. Madam President, civilians should not be harmed. Civilians should not be harmed. They should not fear being killed in their houses or abducted from their homes. Families should not be torn apart. They should be reunited in life, not in death. Reunited in life, not in death. We have been pushing for a ceasefire that guarantees this aim, while Israel continues advocating for more killing and more destruction. There is no military solution to this conflict. You cannot kill your way to a solution. You cannot negate the millions of Palestinians. We are rooted as olive trees deep in our land. You cannot kill all of us. Again, there is no military solution to this conflict, and you cannot kill your way to a solution. The Israeli government is trying to convince its people that killing, dispossession, and displacing Palestinians is the only way forward, while we have, even in the midst of this genocide, continued to plead for achieving our freedom through peaceful means. Our president from this chamber said, I am ready to negotiate and to talk peace. And for those who said Ramallah is so close to Jerusalem, he is ready in Jerusalem and in Ramallah and everywhere to talk peace for those who are ready and willing to talk peace. Palestinians is the only way forward, while we have, even in the midst, as I said, of this genocide, continued to plead for achieving our freedom through peaceful means, for respect for international law, for two states living side by side, as many of you state very often, for shared peace and security. It is for every government around the world to choose now the vision they will rally behind and to use all means available to them to see it prevails. Both sidism and balancing acts will not cut it. You have to decide. You cannot play both ways. The fate of millions of people cannot be left to the decisions of this Israeli government that caters far more to the political survival of Netanyahu than the survival of hostages, that wants to get rid of the Palestinian people and steal Palestinian land, that wants to render occupation permanent and peace impossible. The ceasefire is a test. Failing at it means only prolonging the agony and suffering caused by today's horrors, but setting the stage for horrors to come. It is a test we cannot afford to fail. We have to defeat this option. Peace is the only option available to us, to them, and to all of you. Help us to move in the direction of peace and away from the direction of killing and war. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Assistant Secretary General Chiari for your briefing today. I would like to thank the United States, the UK, and France for calling this important session. Before I begin, I want to thank Eli Sharabi for his courage today. Eli, there are no words that can begin to describe the strength it takes to be here after everything you have endured. None of us can truly comprehend the pain, the suffering, the loss you have endured. The torment of 491 days in captivity, the terror of returning to a home that no longer exists, the weight of knowing that your entire world was taken from you. Yet, despite all of this, you sit here today, not for yourself, but for those who remain behind. For over 530 days, 59 innocent men, women, and children have been trapped in Hamas captivity. Many of them are barely holding on to life. Unfortunately, some of them have been murdered, and Hamas has not let the world see a single one of them. These are innocent people being tortured for the crime of being Israelis or being in Israel. They are starving in the dark, alone, afraid, suffering beyond what words can capture. They are denied food, water, and medicine. They are beaten, tortured, and humiliated. They are being held in conditions so inhuman, so depraved, that the hostages who were freed can barely describe what they endured. The cruelty here is not just from Hamas. It is also from the silence of the world. Eli Sharabi testified before you today and laid bare the horrors of his captivity. He described the torment he endured and spoke for the other hostages still in Hamas's hands. Now the question that demands an answer is this: where is the world? Where is your outrage? Where is the international outcry for their release? Where is the demand from every nation to bring them home? Since October 7th, you have passed 77 resolutions in this chamber. There has not been a single resolution condemning Hamas. Meanwhile, there are those in this chamber who refuse to even mention the hostages. Algeria, you have spent months in this room condemning, accusing, and criticizing Israel. But when a human being sits before you today, after enduring the worst of humanity at the hand of those you defend, you could barely acknowledge his presence. You couldn't find the decency to even say his name. That is outrageous. And the world can see it. For 530 days, you have erased the hostages. You have spoken about Gaza without mentioning the crimes of Hamas. You have debated humanitarian assistance without acknowledging the humanitarian crimes Hamas is deliberately inflicting on the hostages. You have had the audacity to talk about a ceasefire without demanding that those held in Hamas's terror tunnels be freed. How can you claim to stand for international law while ignoring the hostages? How can you speak of human rights when you refuse to recognize the most horrific human rights abuse in this war? How can you sit in this chamber, look Eli Sharabi in the eye, and say nothing? The massive amounts of humanitarian aid that Israel has facilitated, coordinated, and allowed into Gaza have reached every segment of the population except one: the hostages. While Gazan civilians benefit from food, medicine, shelter, and support, these innocent individuals languish in conditions that defy human comprehension. Those hostages have not seen an ounce of that aid. Think how many trucks, how many containers. We listened to you, Eli, that you got a quarter of a pita a day. There are so many on this council, you, who never fail to scream for more aid, more trucks, more shipments, more access, yet you have never once demanded that a single piece of that aid be delivered to our hostages. Not a single word has been spoken. Not a single demand has been made. Not a single resolution has been passed insisting that those in the most desperate need of humanitarian assistance actually receive it. The UN's inaction on the plight of the hostages is a moral collapse of the highest order. To be clear, it's not just this council that has failed. The entire UN system has forsaken its responsibility. So many agencies that claim to be the protectors of humanity have abandoned the hostages entirely. Where was the Security Council? The General Assembly? OCHA? UNICEF? The so-called Human Rights Council? The Red Cross? The Red Cross has not conducted one visit, one inspection. We heard the absurd equation you made about the detainees in Israel. They have 3 meals a day. They have medical treatment. They have visitations of the Red Cross. Before the war, they had visitations of families. How can you compare it? The Red Cross had no one inspection or spent one moment with the hostages in Gaza. And yet, for 530 days, the Red Cross has continued to act according to Hamas's playbook. Colleagues, there is one absolute certainty in this situation. The war will not end until the hostages are freed. Israel did not choose this war. Hamas did. It was Hamas that invaded Israel and Eli's home. It was Hamas that slaughtered our people, and for 3 months it was Hamas who stalled negotiations. Hamas was given the chance to extend the ceasefire. Hamas was given the opportunity to bring relief to the people of Gaza. Hamas was given a choice, and they chose war. Therefore, Israel has resumed its military operations against Hamas with increasing force. The IDF is striking Hamas terror targets throughout the Gaza Strip. Terrorist infrastructure, weapons stockpiles, and command centers are being dismantled. This will continue. This will continue until every last hostage is home. This war does not end with hostages left underground. This war does not end until Hamas is defeated. The choice is simple. If you want a ceasefire, then pressure Hamas to release the hostages immediately. Madam President, Eli Sharabi should not have to be here today. He should have never been taken. He should have never been starved, chained, and brutalized. He should have never lost his wife, his daughters, his brother. And yet, here he is, a survivor of the worst of humanity, asking the world to save those still trapped in that nightmare. I ask you to take a moment and reflect as we speak here today. There are 59 Eli Sharabis underground, desperate for freedom. Imagine their faces. Imagine their screams and their cries. Imagine what they would say to you today. Will you listen or will you look away? Because this moment will not be forgotten. There is no neutrality here. There is no middle ground. There is only right or wrong. We will never stop fighting for the hostages. We will never abandon them. We will never sit idly by as terrorists hold our people as trophies. We will bring them home, all of them. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.